Hello, listeners, and thank you for joining us for CBCDR's second podcast. I'm your host, Matt Rodriguez, Director of Marketing for Coldwell Banker Commercial Devonshire Realty. Something you might have noticed is that our podcast doesn't have an official name yet. As you may remember in our first podcast, I might have let it slip that we're not professionals at making podcasts, and nor do we pretend to be. This is just another example of that, but I can assure you this podcast will have a name in due time. Now, all that aside, I'm honored to introduce our guest for today's podcast, Mr. Bergan and Bud Parkhill. The Parkhills as a family, not just Bergan and Bud, have a tremendous amount of history in the city of Champaign, and we look forward to getting a glimpse of some of that history today. Gentlemen, thank you for being here, and please introduce yourself for our audience.
Yes, I'm Bergan Parkhill. I've lived in Champaign all my life and plan to continue to the future.
And I'm Bud Parkhill, and I grew up in Champaign and currently live in Mahomet.
Thank you, gentlemen. Okay, so for today, I'm very excited to have a guest co-host with me to help navigate today's podcast. And that co-host is Tim Harrington, who, if you'll remember, was our very first guest on our first podcast. As we continue, you'll notice I will periodically have guest co-hosts on the podcast in order to help drive the conversation, because these guest co-hosts will be far more familiar with our guests than I will be, and they'll be able to help drive the conversation more effectively than I will be by myself. So Tim, thank you for sitting in with us today.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here and pleased to be here with the Parkhills. And of course, the Parkhill family has been synonymous with Champaign-Urbana and our business community for well over a century, and we thought it'd be very interesting to understand the history and how the Parkhill family came to be here in our area. And of course, we have benefited from that as a community for a long time, given the various endeavors, both business and community-wise, that the family's been involved with. So I'd like to open by asking Bergan and Bud to give a little detail and history about how did the family end up here and how long ago did that family history in our area start?
Well, I'll start that. My grandfather and grandmother were raised in southern Illinois, and Christopher, where my grandfather was involved in banking and coal mining and farming. In those days, you were kind of master of all things, or maybe master of none. But the reason we came to central Illinois and we moved up here in 1918 was basically part of it was the riots and the union strike in the coal mines. And southern Illinois became quite even more dangerous than Chicago was during the Capone years. And Granddad already had two sons, one in California and one at the University of Illinois, and just decided to get out of southern Illinois, mainly because of the conditions. He'd lost a lot of money in the mining business. Farming was so-so, banking was so-so, and so that's how we ended up in Champaign, and our first residence was on corner of Lynn and University.
Thanks, Bergan. Bud, you might shed light then on what generation that you are in relation to then your grandpa and maybe how that relates to the other family members.
Yeah, Bergan and I are third generation, and the family's been very diversified in a lot of activities here in Champaign-Urbana, and our grandfather and our respective fathers started numerous businesses here, and then it just got passed on down to other generations.
So, are you two cousins then? Is that?
Yeah, we are first cousins.
Okay, and so let's go through some names then. Grandfather's name was?
Well, grandfather was T.D. Parkhill and his wife Emily, and he had 8 children. He had 4 boys and 4 girls.
8 children.
8 children. And the reason he had those was the 5:30 came through every morning at 5:30 and at Christopher, and I think he woke him up. So that's what his excuse was. So anyway, but all of them lived within Illinois for the most part, other than one sister, Ambia, who ended up in California. But John was the oldest, Olin was next, and Bill and Earl, and then they had Ambia and Ruth and Grace and Mildred were the women.
So the family's very entrepreneurial, and always has been. You want to touch on where you think that came from? Was it your grandfather that was?
I think it came from the grandfather, and then I think more than anything, I think my father Olin inherited that trait, and he would go around and was kind of the entrepreneur of his siblings. And he was the idea man, and he'd go out and get things started. And then he was fortunate enough to have his brothers and sisters and brother-in-laws that would kind of come in and run the businesses and pick the pieces up and make them successful.
So of the second generation, your father was one that carried on the tradition of opening and finding new opportunities. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, when he first came to town, he opened a bakery. And
where was that located, Bergan?
Well, I can't actually tell you where that bakery was. Bud, do you know where that bakery was?
No, I was not even aware of the bakery.
And that's what they opened a bakery. And then Olin and TD were in Chicago and saw a bus and thought, that's kind of interesting. And there wasn't any buses around Central Illinois, and they bought a bus. And that started the bus business, which.
Now, what kind of bus was it? Like a long traveling bus, or is it more of a city bus, or?
Well, it would hold 25 or 30 passengers, made by Rio for the most part. But that's how we got into the bus business, was just frankly buying a bus, and then it ended up with we had the main route between Indianapolis and the Quad Cities for a number of years. We ran buses back and forth, and then we took tours to the East Coast and West Coast.
Was there any other competition in terms of long distance liners that bus lines that in Champaign that you were aware of?
Not in the early years, no.
So you guys were kind of the corner of the market when you started
we
the buses.
We were pioneers in it. There were several articles written about Earl and Bill, who were in the bus business more, and they were pretty much pioneers in that to start with.
Were you in that business before the automobile sales or after?
Well, that's interesting because Granddad was at first a brush dealer in 1910, and I have original invoice of the several brushes that they bought, and then he ended up being a Chevrolet dealer in partnership with his brother in Benton, Illinois, which isn't too far from Christopher. And after TD got out of that and moved to Central Illinois or to Champaign, his brother kept a Chevrolet store there, and they didn't get in the automobile business until 1923, when they got the Oldsmobile franchise, and then had the Oldsmobile franchise in Bloomington in 24, and picked up Cadillac in 37. We had Rio in 1945.
You might share a little bit more about Rio. What is that?
Well, Rio was basically a truck franchise in those days, and I think they still made Rios up until after the war, after World War II, but it was bought out by a company later on.
So for our listeners, there might be a touch back to Champaign, because isn't RAO Speedwagon?
I don't know where they picked that up, but we used to work on their cars. Those kids started at the University of Illinois, and I don't know where they came up with the Rio. Actually, the REO stands for Robert E. Olds.
Okay.
That's where the name came from.
Oldsmobile.
Yeah, well, it was Olds.
And Bud, didn't you mention at one time that perhaps it was Grandpa that was meeting with Mr. Olds in Detroit?
Well, they met him someplace in Chicago or Detroit or someplace, and he said, "Well, come on back and let me show you what I'm building here in the way of this bus," as was my recollection of the story. And he said, that he felt that the family could use a bus down here to haul the U of I, because of the U of I, and haul the U of I band and athletic teams to the various places. And So it was, like I say, it was my understanding that kind of got it started. But they were, the family was selling Rio trucks, and I think Rio did make an automobile at one time, but at any rate, they were making these buses, and so that precipitated the business getting going.
Let's talk about the ranch and how that evolved and how the family got involved with that part of it as it relates to the bus operation.
Well, as I say, we were running tours. We formed a tour company and took a big part of our tours were from the Normal State Teachers College. They'd take 25 or 30 women in the summer out to Washington, D.C. and points and Gettysburg and all along the way. And then we decided to run them west. And in 1938, the boys decided they'd buy a couple ranches out there and use that as a destination. So they purchased a ranch in Beehive, Montana, which was a working cattle ranch. And then they purchased another ranch on Flathead Lake, which is still there. It's Flathead Lake Lodge. We ran those tours pretty successfully up until 43. The war came along in 41. And from that time on until 45, gas became shorter and shorter. All our counselors were in the military. A lot of parents didn't want their kids traveling, couldn't afford to travel. So we came on financial hard times at that time, and the boys ended up selling those ranches. The one in Beehive kind of got parceled out into individual home sites along the Stillwater River, and the man that bought Flathead Lake Lodge was a man named Bill Avery, who was a B-24 pilot in World War II and came back and bought the ranch at a very favorable price. And he and his son have turned that into the only five-star resort in the state of Montana. And it's still going strong. It's a wonderful place.
Sounds like a beautiful area. Now, did either of you get to go to camp there or spend any time at the ranches?
Well, I'm older than Bud, and I spent from age 4 to age 11 at one of those ranches every summer.
What a treat.
What a treat. And I would have still been there if we'd had the ranches. I'd been a rancher.
You were not happy when the ranch was
Well,
sold.
I didn't have any choice. I was 11 years old. They dropped the atomic bomb, and everything else was going on.
Did you get a chance, or that was...
I have visited the ranches in the last 10 years, but I was so young that I don't recall being there. When I was at, the only one I remember or that I was acquainted with was Beehive, and I was 2 years old at that time.
Did you get a tour when you were there?
We got a beautiful tour when we went up to Flathead Lodge, and the current owners, which are the same family that bought it from our folks, invited us to dinner, took us out on a sailboat on Flathead Lake, and were very gracious, and had a great time.
And Bergan, weren't you telling me at Flathead Lake Ranch that you were that it was kind of a destination spot for some celebrities and some A-listers?
Matthew Ridgway and Eisenhower both spent their summers there for a number of years. I think it was after the war and prior to his presidency, I think. I'm not sure he was there after he was president, but I'm sure the Avery family could give us a long list of celebrities.
So to wrap up on the bus operation, let's fast forward, and you're no longer in that business. So walk us through, what occurred and where that ended up.
Well, the inner city bus line became less and less profitable over the years, and so we sold that to an outfit out of Indianapolis in 1997, wasn't it, Bud? I think. So. And he ran it for a couple of years. We took a kind of what you might say a slow note on that, and the slow note never came in. So we basically he went bankrupt, and there was not much left. So, and we continued to run tours for a few years. We operated a tour agency, and our Bud's brother Tom and my cousin ran the tour agency for a number of years there, and we gradually phased that out. And the bus business has changed a great deal, and so that was kind of the end of it at that time.
Okay. And then let's talk about each of your respective roles in the family today and what you spent your careers on. Bergan, maybe start with you. Where did you start and end your career, even though you're not ended? I know at this point you're still very active, but tell us about your career.
Well, I came back out of school after DePaul University. I started selling cars. I liked the automobile business. My father wanted me to get into the bus business, but I had very little interest in that. And so I've spent 42 years in the automobile business. During that time, Bob Parkhill and cousin Richard Parkhill were involved at it from various times. I stayed there the whole 42 years. Bob retired in 63, basically. I guess it was 73. Dick, we picked up the Renault and Peugeot franchise, and Dick ran that for a while. We moved to Carriage Center in 69. Carriage Center was basically the brainchild of a realtor in town by the name of Cy Vaughn. And Cy Vaughn went around to Warden Martin and to University Ford, which was John Rayburn and Dick Lever at that time, and to us, and said, "You guys are in junk facilities. You need to do something." And we kind of looked at each other and said, "What do you mean junk facilities?" "Well, I think you can do better." And he said, "I got a piece of land down here that's owned by the Ross Mattis Camp Estate. It's right on the hill across from Hillcrest." And he said, "I think you ought to buy that down there and develop it and put the 3 dealerships there." And you know, that he started it, and we looked at it, and we contacted our various franchisors, and they approved it, and we went down and divided it up in 3 pieces, and Warden Martin put Chrysler Plymouth down there at that time, and we put Oldsmobile Cadillac, and University Ford went down there, and that stayed and was very successful for 36 years or so until things started to change a little bit, and automobile business was changing, and I contacted the Sullivan family, and we worked out a merger because I figured that with Oldsmobile sales slipping and the money all going into Saturn, which I could spend 30 minutes talking about that, but I won't. I thought it was best, so we moved up there. That left our building vacant, and at that time, Dennis Noonan was very interested in moving off of Bloomington Road. He had just purchased Nissan there, and so he rented my building for a few years. Ford then sold out, and there was a bankruptcy there, and ended up George Chaplin buying that, and he moved into my building with Lincoln Mercury, and then after that, the pressure was on the Chaplin family to upgrade their Ford facilities. They would not give them the franchise unless they did do something, and George worked that for 2 or 3 years and finally agreed to do it. Nissan was the same way, and that left Carriage Center vacant. And since the Harringtons didn't have anything to put in down there, and we couldn't do anything else, we had 3 vacant buildings. George and I decided we better develop this thing. So
what a success that was.
We went back to Tim Harrington and his crew, and we've got 11 nice lots down there, and the rest is history, and I think it looks better than it's ever looked.
It's a thriving area, that's for sure, and it seems like the dealerships were destined to be more in interstate locations, largely probably because of the dealers or the franchisors were requesting that.
Well, their market share was changing, and they were upgrading facilities. And after 30-some years at Carriage Center, I thought those buildings were pretty darn good, but the manufacturers didn't. In '91, I did buy Buick Pontiac GMC from Dale Allen in Danville, and John Isle, who worked for Rogers Chevrolet at one time, I hired him to run it, and he was a small partnership in it, and he ran it for 17 years and sold it in '98.
So today, who's running Sullivan Parkhill?
David Parkhill, my son. Basically, when we did that merger, Jim Sullivan and I both stepped aside, and David and Kevin took over. And after 5 or 6 years, Kevin decided he'd had enough of the automobile business, wanted to do something else. So son David bought Kevin out, and the Sullivan family has still a small portion of it, but David has the bulk of it.
And when did you say the merger was of Sullivan?
That was in 98.
98, okay.
So, in summary, there's been Parkhills in the automobile business for virtually a century here in our area.
In 2010, we'd hit 100 years, if you want to count the brush franchise. And I've got an original franchise. You can buy a brush for $600. So.
Well, Bud, let's move to you. Let's hear about your interesting history, and I want to also touch on the family's involvement in the Muhammad area as well. But tell us about your background.
Well, I think that my background kind of stems from my father, since he was the entrepreneur of the family, so to speak. I think I inherited that trait a little bit, and in a minor way, and so I ended up, and he kind of steered me into the land development phase of it and the excavating business. So they were the family, the brothers, my uncles and my father were doing some subdivisions, and we had some excavating equipment, and so we ended up building some of the subdivisions, the roads and the lakes and so forth. And so I was kind of in charge of that. And then that just moved on to other things. And I tried to, out of college, I tried to be a farmer, and I wasn't cut out to be a farmer. So I was farming one farm, and I decided, having watched my father build a mobile home park in Punta Gorda, Florida, I decided, well, I'd maybe attempt to do that with the construction equipment. And so I got in the mobile home business, and we built a park, and it just celebrated its 54th anniversary.
And you're referring to Candlewood?
I'm referring to Candlewood. So we built that, and then I've owned other mobile home parks in Champaign County, several other parks, but that industry's been awful good to me, and I've basically have done subdivisions and some commercial property and the mobile home thing.
Now, Bud, tell them about Lake of the Woods.
Oh yeah, right. I don't know exactly, Bergan, when the family purchased the land at Lake of the Woods, but they did join up with another family by the name of Keene, and our family owned, say, the north half of the property, and the Keene family owned the south half. And then right after the war, World War II, my father decided that he would build a dam in a ravine, and that's what created the lake at Lake of the Woods. And so my older brother worked on that project, and that was built in like 1946 to 48, I think.
So that's how the family got involved in the Muhammad area originally?
Well, they had other farmland there, and then when the ranches got closed down, because out in Montana the ranches had horses and a lot of stuff, and my father ended up and his brothers shipped the horses back to some of a farm here in Champaign County, and so they acquired that, and then the farms were up and down the Sangamon River, and as I've been led to believe, and there's evidence is out there, but when they built Willard Airport, my father at that point in time was in the gravel business, and so he supplied, he and his brothers supplied the gravel for all the runways and the undersurface for Willard Airport, U of I Airport.
That's great. Let's talk about the farming, because that sounds like in the history of the family, that's had a big part of that overall operation. Today, you're still in the farming?
Yes, we're still in the farming business, and one of my brothers is the active farmer, and that's Tom Parkhill, and now he's been farming for a number of years, and now he's passing it on to his children. But at any rate, they are the active farmers. They're the tenant farmers, and Tom has an interest in the farm, and as we all do. So the farming's doing fairly well.
And you're still active in Muhammad, and any projects?
Well, I'm still somewhat active in Muhammad, and we have some commercial property, and I still operate the mobile home park, and we're selling manufactured housing, and still having fun doing it.
That's the thing you want to do, is keep doing what you're having fun with. Where do we go from here with the legacy of the Parkhill family? Where do you see the future?
Well, it depends how long we live, you know. We've got, you know, real estate, commercial property here in Champaign, and the farms out in Mahomet, and the mobile home park, and Bud's got 2 boys. One of them's fairly active with him in working there, and David's running the dealership, and so we'll have to see what stays together and what is acquired or what is sold, and you know, it's there's an end of all things, so who knows what the future holds.
Well, I'm sure with the entrepreneurial spirit that's been the history of the Parkhill family, that will be continued well into the future, and I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in the future. Any growing up stories or any funny things that you guys can think of?
We love story time here with a podcast.
So
I have to say that when TH and Tim were telling their stories on our last podcast, that
any unusual happenings or occurrences or
that was
things
our
that
favorite.
kind of just trip your memory to say, I can't believe that happened?
Well, I'll tell you one story. In 1950, we were having Thanksgiving at my dad's house on William Street, and I was 16 years old, and Mother was cooking everything, and pretty soon Dad got a phone call that Thompson Lumber Company was on fire. And so Dad and I took off, and Mother stood on the front porch, and as everybody came to the thing, they dropped off their mashed potatoes and their baked beans or whatever, and took off. And so we ended up down on Neal Street, and the fire department had their hands full. The whole roof was on fire, and the wind was out of the north. And it was just about to take Parkhill Motor Sales, which was on 702 South Neal, and all there was a street between Thompson's and the dealership. The heat was so bad that it cracked the glass. Dana Huddleston, the Ford dealer, came by later on and said, "I've always wanted to throw a brick through your window," and he did. And but the firemen were standing and hiding behind Quaker State oil signs, the old ones, and the paint was blistering off the other side of the signs trying to keep that fire. And if the wind hadn't changed, it would have taken the building. And there have been thoughts about at that time that, you know, might have been a good deal. We could build a new store. That building was built in 1910. We moved into it in 1923. But it didn't. But during that time, the building was full of buses and service cars, customer cars, and new cars. So at the south end of the building, we were driving cars out as fast as we could get them over onto the west side of the street. And we did have to get the building emptied. And I can remember my Uncle John pointing to a flexible bus, which I'd never driven. I was 16 years old. He says, "Get that thing out of here." And I started to say, "I don't know how to drive it." And there was no excuse. So I got in and drove it, but I did take the side view mirrors off.
I'm sure at that point he didn't mind.
He did mind.
Oh, did he?
But he did mind. But he did apologize later because the bus got out. But
It was a stressful situation.
Yeah.
there was 30 minutes there that maybe I was a little bit chagrined about the whole thing. But anyway, we got everything out of it, and the firemen did a wonderful job. Saved our building. We had some roof damage, and all the glass broke out. But other than that, so that was kind of a tragedy. I have all the articles and stuff on it, but. That led Thompson to build a new building.
So you brought some books with you.
Yeah, I brought
Are you
some
the
books.
family historian?
Well, I just made myself one.
What do you have throughout the books? What do you keep there? What's some of the interesting things?
pretty much the history of everything in pictures, and when we get off of here, I'll let you thumb through them for a minute. I won't take too long to read the stuff, but just let you thumb through, and you'll see a little bit what we've been talking about.
Great. But anything in your interesting history that comes to mind as a...
Well, not right offhand. Dealing with 500 tenants in the mobile home park, you have some experiences, and they've all been very good. And you got to, to operate a place like that, you've got to kind of be a people person. You got to enjoy folks, and you hear a lot of things, and you're a counselor some days, and sometimes you're a collection agency, and you wear different hats, and it's all good. So.
Well, gentlemen, we really appreciate the time that you've shared with us, and the interesting history of the family and the businesses and family members, and And Bob's still doing well. He's living
Very well.
in Florida, as I understand it. Matt, I'll turn it over to you. But again, from our perspective here at Coldwell Banker Commercial Devonshire Realty, we've had a long-standing relationship with the Parkhill family and look to do that in the future as long as we can. And I can tell you it's been a pleasure working with the family in every aspect that we've been involved in, and appreciate you taking the time today.
On a personal note, it's been wonderful to be a fly on the wall here for our own podcast. It's been a great history lesson. I've learned so much in just 30 minutes, and I can't wait to learn more, just speaking with both of you privately, and learn more about the history of Champaign from having grown up here all my life, never knowing the history of Sullivan Parkhill or the gravel for the runways at Willard. I mean, it seems that you have fingers in all aspects of Champaign, and rightfully so. So I just, for personal note, thank you for coming by and sharing all your stories with us, and hopefully our listeners enjoyed it as well. So to our listeners, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this podcast, and thank you so much for listening.